When I first heard about the protests, I thought there was probably, when it continued, I thought there was probably something suspect about it, because usually if it's got something to do with China or Russia or, you just know that, particularly China at the moment, with all the anti-Chinese propaganda from the US empire, you sort of know there's probably something going on that's related to the CIA trying to stir up trouble or something like that.
I have no doubt that there are foreign hands in this trouble. I see this as another of these color-coded revolutions, so-called, that took place in the Ukraine and in Georgia and many other places.
What's going on in Hong Kong may not actually be what it appears to be, that there's something behind this, something pushing, someone perhaps with an agenda. Is he right?
Yes, you could certainly say he's right, and this is an element of the Hong Kong protests that are not being so that's not being so covered in the Western corporate press. Yeah. No surprise there. So I want to show you something. I want to show you the organizers of these anti-extradition law. They call themselves the Civil Human Rights Front, and I want to show you the members of the organizations of this Civil Human Rights Front. So
these are the protesters.
That's right, the organizers of these protesters. Okay. Not all of the protesters are part of these groups, but these are the organizers. We've got the Hong Kong Institute of Human Resource Management. We've got the Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Unions, as well as a number of others. Now, what do all of these organizations that you see listed here have in common?
Tell me.
They're all taking money, and they've all worked with an organization called the National Endowment for Democracy. They've all received funding from this organization. Now, the National Endowment for Democracy has been funding groups in Hong Kong. This goes back to the 90s, but just in the last year, the Hong Kong Institute for Human Resource Management, which is the first thing that you saw on your list there moments ago, got $90,000 in just 1 year, in just 2018, from the National Endowment for Democracy.
Would you tell us, so our viewers can understand, who the hell is the National Endowment for Democracy? Who are these people?
That's right. So who is this NGO funding these protesters, right? Great question. I'm so glad you asked. So let's listen to Carl Gershman. Here's what he had to say. He was actually the president of the National Endowment for Democracy at the time he said this. He said, "It would be terrible for democratic groups around the world to be seen as subsidized by the CIA. We saw that in the 60s, and that's why it's been discontinued. That's why the endowment was created." So here we have this NGO that's been created to, in a sense, do the CIA's work overtly. And let's hear it from Alan Weinstein, who actually helped draft the legislation to create the NED. Here's how he put it. He put it a bit simpler. He said, "A lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA." So you don't have to take it from me. You can take it from these men who were involved from the ground up at the National Endowment for Democracy. Here they are saying that this is, in a sense, a front for the CIA itself. And as you know, the CIA loves funding opposition groups.
Well, but, you know, a lot of Americans don't know this, right? I mean, you and I this weekend were texting back and forth about the fact that just as back in 2009, the United States actually perpetrated a coup in Honduras, the country where we're having all these problems now with all these immigrants coming.
That's right.
The Obama administration, and it was led by none other than Hillary Clinton, right?
That's
so
right.
That's kind of,
and that's just
we do this.
Many right-wing coups that the U.S. has supported in the past. Of course, the National Endowment for Democracy was involved in Honduras as well, though. That's a good point.
Anyway, I just want to read you a little bit of this essay, and then I'll see if I can find out who originally posted this. The Hong Kong protests against the extradition law that proposes sending fugitives to mainland China has become headlines in Western mainstream media. There is a lot of hooting and cheering for the Hong Kong protesters in the columns of media outlets like the New York Times, CNN, BBC, The Guardian, etc. You know, if it's one of those mainstream media outlets, that there's probably something wrong, because they don't care about what's happening in France with the yellow vests. It's been like, I don't know, 40 weeks or something. Every week, the yellow vest protests, the neoliberalism, the austerity of the French government. Do you hear anything in the mainstream media? No. And there are other protests going on around the world, like in Venezuela. There's massive protests in favor of against the U.S. empire and their meddling. Mass protests in Venezuela. You know, and you won't hear anything. There's other protests too, but the ones, when you know that the mainstream media is actually promoting a particular protest, you know that it probably has very little to do with changing the status quo, and is also in favor of helping U.S. empire in some way. So anyway, the, quote, pro-democracy, end quote, lobby of the American British press, who remained conspicuously silent on the massive anti-government demonstrations in France against the tyrant Macron regime, since November 2018, have been vociferously battling against the extradition bill introduced in the Legislative Council of Hong Kong. The overenthusiasm shown by the Western press over the Hong Kong rallies and protests, where the protesters waved banners of Donald Trump, the fascist American president, and the British flag, asking the imperialist powers to, quote, liberate Hong Kong, end quote. You probably noticed too that there's always a stream of people begging John Bolton, Mr. Democracy, I say that in a joking way, to liberate Venezuela. I mean, it's just disgusting. I mean, the U.S. has imposed economic sanctions on Venezuela that have killed 40,000 Venezuelans. You won't hear that in the mainstream media. Anyway, and I'll continue that sentence, clearly indicates that like the, quote, umbrella protests, end quote, this recent outrage over the extradition law with China is not organic. Rather, it's a manufactured one with the omnipresent involvement of the notorious U.S. spy agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. For the U.S. and the UK, it's important that Hong Kong, a part of China that was brutally colonized and exploited by the by the British imperialists for years, remains separated from the country through artificial lines of, quote, autonomy, end quote, just like they vehemently oppose any proposal by China to integrate Taiwan, its inalienable part, which the U.S. vassal Chiang Kai-shek occupied in 1949 after his Kuomintang government lost in the civil war against the Chinese communists led by Mao Zedong. As the Formosa Islands of China became and eventually remained, quote, the Republic of China, end quote, for many years, as per the American strategy to isolate the People's Republic of China, ruled by the communists for decades, to finally become Taiwan, a neo-colony of the U.S. and other imperialist powers. So is Hong Kong the island nation that became a prized possession for the British imperialism to vacate emotionally? Though the British imperialists had to leave the islands in 1997, handing it over to China for an autonomous rule under a strange arrangement known as, quote, one country, two systems, end quote, designed by the opportunist communists after the restoration of state capitalism in post-Mao China, they, in cahoots with the local lackeys, kept things under their virtual control by limiting the Chinese influence in the government. Anyhow, there's about another 3 paragraphs which I won't read. The last paragraph is, as the protesters are rampaging on the streets, their protests turning extremely violent with each passing day, resulting into massive riots and vandalism, apart from targeted attacks on bystanders, apart from the police to raise an emotive tug, it's clear that this movement isn't about any short-term goals of stopping a bill, but has long-term objectives. One of the objectives is clearly a, quote, regime change, end quote. Carrie Lam, the embattled leader of Hong Kong, is seriously at the receiving end, as the US and its allies want her ousted through their manufactured, quote-unquote, public dissent, which is what is dragging this non-issue movement for so long. So that's interesting. So another attempt at regime change, which will probably end up being successful, or it'll end up with the Chinese government cracking down in a very heavy-duty way, and then, of course, they'll start throwing that out there. And it's just, the anti-Chinese propaganda is going to get more and more pronounced as time goes by. And if you've noticed in those Democratic debates, when they were asked what is the greatest threat or something to the US, they all said, pretty much all of them in the first debate said China, because they've that's their new thing, that China is an economic threat to the US, meaning that it's just doing well in its capitalist ventures around the world, and the US is actually flailing. The US empire is flailing, and China and Russia and some other countries, it's becoming a multipolar world, and the US wants it to be a unipolar world. They want to be the empire that controls everything. And so they see China as an economic threat now, and China is making friends with all these other countries, and the US is not making friends with countries, and it's putting sanctions on everybody and trying to invade countries like Iran and Venezuela and so forth, as it's always been doing for decades and decades. And, so it sort of sees that it's losing its unipolar control in the world, and China is now the target. John Pilger, who is a journalist, an Australian journalist, did a documentary called The Coming War on China, and that's a possibility. And the other target, of course, is Russia, because Russia is it doesn't have as big it has probably it spends a tenth of what the US does on the military, but it has these has nuclear parity with its incredibly technologically advanced nuclear weapons to be a deterrent to the US. And of course, sadly, there's this talk of these complete I don't know what else to call them, but psychopaths in the Pentagon who think that a nuclear war is winnable now, and they're not even that concerned about mutually assured destruction. It's sort of, I'm going to find that thing I listened to the other night. Ralph Nader was interviewing somebody about this, and I'm going to share some of that with you, which is very scary, because even the nuclear deterrence to America, it doesn't seem to be a factor anymore. They in fact seem to want to use their nuclear weapons. And of course, when you have, if all you have is nails and the only thing you've got is a hammer, you're going to, it's sort of one of these things where they once you have those weapons, you want to use them, and they've already used them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So why does anybody think they're not going to use them on somebody else again? And they think that they can do so by these they call them limited nuclear weapons that are supposed to cause lesser damage and stuff, as if that's going to not bring the house down, if they start using those weapons. I mean, Russia is not going to sit back and allow that to happen. So anyway, I'll find that Ralph Nader program that they did. It was very interesting. I was listening to it last night, and I'll share some of the points from that. Anyway, so another attempt at regime change by the CIA via these sort of faux protests in Hong Kong, and that are going on and on and on, and yet the mainstream media ignoring all the other protests that are going on in the world because it doesn't suit them, because they are threatening the status quo. They're all sort of irrelevant. That the only time the mainstream media ever focuses on a particular protest is if there's something in it for the US. Usually there's something in it for US empire. Anyway, so thanks so much for watching. Please click the notifications bell and the subscribe button if you haven't already. If you don't click the notifications bell, you don't receive updates about the most recent posts I do. And please leave comments if you wish. I always enjoy your comments. So thanks so much for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Till next time, bye for now.